The year was 550 BCE, and in the bustling streets of Babylon, the greatest empire the world had ever known was about to be brought to its knees, not by armies or siege engines, but by a single man with nothing more than his wit and an audacious plan. What you're about to hear is the story of history's most successful con artist, a man who fooled kings, priests, and even convinced an entire civilization that he could speak directly to the gods themselves. His name was Nabu-rimanni, and by the time the authorities realized what he had done, he had vanished with enough treasure to ransom an empire, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would contribute to the fall of one of history's greatest civilizations. Picture ancient Babylon at the height of its power, the hanging gardens rising like green mountains above the city, the Tower of Babel stretching toward the heavens, streets filled with merchants from India, Egypt, and the far reaches of the known world. This was the center of human civilization, where kings ruled by divine mandate and priests controlled the flow of knowledge between earth and heaven. It was a world built on absolute faith in authority, which made it the perfect hunting ground for a master manipulator. Nabu-rimanni didn't start as a criminal. In fact, he began life as a legitimate scribe in the service of the great temple of Marduk. Educated, intelligent, and trusted with access to the most sacred texts of Babylonian religion. He understood how the system worked, how the priests maintained their power through claims of divine communication, how the king justified his authority through supposed messages from the gods. And slowly, methodically, he began to realize that the entire structure was built on lies that could be exploited. The genius of Nabu-rimanni's scheme wasn't its complexity, it was its simplicity. Rather than trying to overthrow the system, he decided to become it. He would convince everyone that he alone possessed the true connection to the divine, that the existing priests were frauds, and that only through him could the gods' will be properly understood. It was a con so audacious that it required fooling an entire civilization. But Nabu-rimanni had spent years studying exactly how to make people believe the impossible. His first step was establishing credibility. Nabu-rimanni began making predictions about minor events, floods, eclipses, the outcomes of distant battles. Using his knowledge of astronomy, weather patterns, and information networks that existed throughout the empire, he was able to make prophecies that came true with startling accuracy. Word began to spread through Babylon's markets and taverns about the scribe who could see the future, and people started paying attention. But Nabu-rimanni understood that small-scale success wasn't enough. If he wanted to pull off the greatest con in history, he needed to aim higher, much higher. He began targeting the wealthy merchants and minor nobility, offering them private consultations where he would reveal messages supposedly sent directly from Marduk himself. These weren't vague, mystical pronouncements. They were specific, actionable advice about business dealings, political alliances, and personal decisions. The brilliance of his approach lay in the preparation. Before each consultation, Nabu-rimanni would spend weeks gathering intelligence about his target, their business interests, their family relationships, their fears and ambitions. He employed a network of servants, slaves, and informants throughout the city, people who were invisible to the wealthy elite but who heard and saw everything. Armed with this information, he could make predictions and revelations that seemed impossibly accurate. When a merchant worried about a trade venture, Nabu-rimanni would reveal that Marduk had shown him the exact dangers that lay ahead, and for a substantial fee he would provide divine protection through special rituals and blessed amulets. When a nobleman feared political rivals, Nabu-rimanni would describe their enemies' plans in perfect detail, information he had gathered through careful espionage but presented as divine revelation. The word of his powers spread like wildfire through Babylon's upper classes. Soon he was being summoned to private mansions and even minor palaces, charging enormous fees for his services and building a reputation as the most powerful, spiritual figure in the empire. But Nabu-rimanni had his sights set on an even greater prize. He wanted to fool the king himself. King Nabonidus was the perfect target for Nabu-rimanni's scheme. Deeply religious, politically insecure, and obsessed with signs and portents, Nabonidus spent much of his time seeking divine guidance for his decisions. He was also increasingly unpopular with the traditional priesthood due to his unorthodox religious ideas. This created an opening that Nabu-rimanni was perfectly positioned to exploit. The con artist's approach to the king was masterful in its subtlety. Rather than seeking an audience directly, he arranged for word of his powers to reach the royal court through carefully orchestrated channels. Nobles who had experienced his supposedly divine insights began mentioning him to other courtiers. Stories of his accurate predictions were shared in the palace halls. And gradually King Nabonidus became curious about this mysterious scribe who seemed to have a direct line to the gods. When Nabu-rimanni finally appeared before the king, he came prepared with the most audacious deception of his career. Using his knowledge of palace intrigue, enemy movements, and political tensions throughout the empire, he delivered a series of prophecies that left Nabonidus stunned. He warned of specific threats to the kingdom, revealed the treachery of certain officials, and provided strategic advice that proved remarkably sound when implemented. But the true masterstroke came when Nabu-rimanni claimed to have received a direct message from Marduk about a great treasure hidden somewhere in the empire. According to his divine vision, the gods had concealed vast riches in a secret location, wealth that rightfully belonged to the faithful king of Babylon, but which could only be located and claimed through the proper religious rituals that required enormous resources to perform correctly. King Nabonidus was completely captivated by this revelation. The idea that the gods had set aside special treasure for his kingdom appealed to both his religious beliefs and his practical concerns about financing his ongoing military campaigns. He authorized Nabu-rimanni to begin the elaborate ceremonies needed to locate this divine treasure, providing him with access to the royal treasury and almost unlimited resources. What followed was perhaps the most elaborate treasure hunt hoax in ancient history. Nabu-rimanni organized massive expeditions to various locations throughout the empire, each supposedly revealed through divine visions. These expeditions involved hundreds of workers, elaborate religious ceremonies, and enormous expenses, all paid for by the royal treasury and all carefully designed to drain as much wealth as possible from the kingdom's coffers. The genius of the scheme was that every failed expedition could be explained away through religious reasoning. The gods were testing the king's faith. Evil spirits were interfering with the divine messages. Additional rituals and offerings were needed to ensure success. Each failure became justification for even more elaborate and expensive attempts. And Nabu-rimanni grew richer with every expedition that found nothing. Meanwhile, the con artist was systematically looting the Babylonian treasury through a network of carefully placed accomplices. Every expedition required supplies, equipment, and payments to workers, much of which was diverted into Nabu-rimanni's personal accounts. He had essentially convinced the king to fund his own robbery, and to thank him for the privilege. The scale of the theft was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that Nabu-rimanni's treasure hunting expeditions consumed over half of Babylon's royal treasury. Gold, silver, precious stones, and valuable artifacts worth millions in today's currency, all supposedly invested in finding divine treasure that existed only in the con artist's imagination. The economic impact was so severe that it weakened Babylon's military capabilities and contributed to the kingdom's eventual conquest by Cyrus the Great. But Nabu-rimanni's greatest achievement wasn't just stealing from the king. It was convincing the entire royal court that he was performing a sacred service. Nobles competed for the privilege of funding his expeditions. Priests sought his approval for their own religious ceremonies. Even foreign ambassadors requested audiences with the man who could supposedly speak directly to Marduk. He had become more powerful than many of the empire's governors, and all through the simple expedient of telling people what they wanted to hear. The psychological manipulation involved in maintaining such an elaborate deception was extraordinary. Nabu-rimanni had to keep track of dozens of different lies, coordinate the activities of numerous accomplices, and constantly adapt his story to account for unexpected developments. He employed techniques that modern con artists would recognize, creating artificial scarcity by limiting access to his services, using social proof by encouraging satisfied customers to spread word of his powers, and exploiting cognitive biases that made people want to believe in supernatural explanations for natural events. Perhaps most impressively, he managed to maintain his deception even when things went wrong. When one of his treasure expeditions was attacked by bandits, Nabu-rimanni claimed it was divine punishment for the king's insufficient faith. When political enemies questioned his methods, he accused them of being influenced by evil spirits who opposed the god's will. Every challenge to his authority became evidence of supernatural forces trying to prevent his sacred mission. But even the most skillful con artist can't maintain such an elaborate deception forever. The turning point came when King Nabonidus began demanding to see actual results from the treasure expeditions. The kingdom was facing increasing military pressure from Persian forces, and the king needed tangible wealth to fund his defenses. Nabu-rimanni realized that his time was running out, and he began planning his escape. The final phase of the con was as audacious as everything that had come before. Nabu-rimanni claimed to have received a vision that the gods required him to undertake a special pilgrimage to retrieve the most sacred artifacts needed for the final treasure location ritual. This journey would take him far from Babylon, possibly to the edge of the known world, and would require him to travel with a substantial portion of the remaining treasury to ensure the gods' favor. King Nabonidus, still completely under Nabu-rimanni's spell, authorized this final expedition, providing the con artist with a massive caravan loaded with treasure, royal guards for protection, and official documents granting him authority to act in the king's name throughout the empire. It was essentially a license to steal on an unprecedented scale, and Nabu-rimanni intended to make the most of it. What happened next remains one of history's great mysteries. Nabu-rimanni and his treasure-laden caravan left Babylon in great ceremonial splendor, witnessed by thousands of citizens who had gathered to see the man who would finally unlock the gods' hidden wealth. But somewhere in the vast deserts between Babylon and the Persian frontier, the entire expedition simply vanished. When Nabu-rimanni failed to return after several months, search parties were sent to find him. They discovered the remains of his caravan at an oasis about 200 miles from Babylon, but the site told a confusing story. There were signs of a struggle, dead guards and servants, scattered equipment, but no sign of Nabu-rimanni himself or any of the treasure he had been carrying. Some believed he had been killed by bandits who had made off with the royal treasure. Others suspected that rival kingdoms had assassinated him to prevent Babylon from accessing divine wealth. But a few astute observers began to suspect the truth, that the entire expedition had been staged, that Nabu-rimanni had arranged his own disappearance and was now living comfortably somewhere beyond the reach of Babylonian justice. The evidence supporting this theory was circumstantial but compelling. Several of the supposed dead guards were never definitively identified. Some of the scattered equipment appeared to have been deliberately damaged rather than destroyed in battle. And most tellingly, none of the special religious artifacts that Nabu-rimanni claimed were essential for his mission were found among the wreckage. The aftermath of Nabu-rimanni's disappearance was catastrophic for Babylon. King Nabonidus, faced with an empty treasury and growing military threats, was forced to admit that he had been deceived. The revelation that the kingdom's resources had been squandered on a fraudulent treasure hunt undermined confidence in the royal government and contributed to the internal divisions that made Babylon vulnerable to Persian conquest. Within 2 years of Nabu-rimanni's disappearance, Cyrus the Great had conquered Babylon without significant resistance. The once mighty empire fell partly because its treasury had been emptied by a single con artist who understood exactly how to exploit the religious beliefs and psychological weaknesses of his targets. The man who had convinced a king that he could speak to gods had ultimately brought down one of history's greatest civilizations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is how completely Nabu-rimanni vanished from historical memory. Unlike other famous criminals from the ancient world, he left behind no monuments, no legends, no stories passed down through generations. It was as if he had deliberately arranged to be forgotten, possibly as the final element of his masterful deception. Modern historians have found scattered references to the treasure expeditions in various Babylonian records, but Nabu-rimanni himself is mentioned only in a handful of documents, and even then usually in coded language that suggests the authorities were embarrassed by how thoroughly they had been fooled. The man who pulled off the greatest con in ancient history managed to erase himself so completely that most people have never heard his name, yet traces of his influence can be found throughout subsequent history. The techniques he pioneered, exploiting religious beliefs for personal gain, creating artificial credibility through staged successes, using inside information to fake supernatural knowledge, would be employed by countless fraudsters and cult leaders throughout the ages. He established a template for large-scale deception that remains remarkably effective even today. The story of Nabu-rimanni serves as a timeless warning about the dangers of unquestioning faith in authority. The Babylonians were among the most sophisticated people of their era. They had developed mathematics, astronomy, and legal systems that influenced civilization for millennia. Yet they were completely taken in by a con artist who told them what they wanted to hear and confirmed their existing beliefs about divine intervention in human affairs. The lesson is particularly relevant in our modern world, where new technologies and communication methods create fresh opportunities for sophisticated deception. The psychological principles that Nabu-rimanni exploited: people's desire to believe in simple solutions to complex problems, their willingness to trust authority figures who confirm their preconceptions, their reluctance to question systems that seem to benefit them, remain as powerful today as they were 2,500 years ago. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that even the mightiest institutions can be brought down by individuals who understand their weaknesses. Babylon seemed invincible to its contemporaries, protected by massive walls, defended by powerful armies, governed by sophisticated bureaucracies. Yet one clever con artist managed to hollow out its treasury and contribute to its downfall, simply by understanding how human psychology works and exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. The next time someone promises you easy wealth, divine favor, or inside knowledge that seems too good to be true, remember Nabu-rimanni and the treasures of Babylon, because the greatest con artists in history have always succeeded by making their victims feel special, chosen, and just a little bit smarter than everyone else. If stories of ancient deception and their modern parallels fascinate you, subscribe to The Grey Hour for more explorations of how the past continues to echo in our present, because sometimes the oldest tricks are still the most effective ones.